Yes, so I think we will begin. You're all very welcome to this roundtable on cultures of rejection in the COVID crisis, which I have the honor to host here. I think I don't think that I have to introduce the people here on the panel. I think you all know each other. But yeah, we will talk about different perspectives on the protests of COVID-19 deniers during this pandemic. Yeah, and to reflect on different pictures, similarities, differences in these protests, and what we can learn from reflecting these protests relationally and talking. Yeah, and we will have three aspects which we like to address together. The first one will be the different dynamics of the protests themselves. The second will be the relations between institutional decisions and protest formations, as well as process of institutionalization during these protests. And third, we will shed light on reasons and motives behind these protests. So, the first question I want to ask is, in what, and we will start with the Serbian case. So, Milan, what happened during the protests in your case? What were the main events and how was the protest embedded in long-term trajectories?
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So, I would say that the protests in Serbia, like many things here, were in a way over-determined by the political situation, the political instability, the authoritarian regime, etc. So the first protest, the first kind of type of protest, I would say, happened during the curfews that were in the beginning of the pandemic, so in the spring of 2020. And they were started by the political opposition in Serbia with the idea that since people had the agreement, it was propagated online, that since the pandemic is difficult and the doctors, the medical staff are working a lot, the people would clap on their windows, applaud the medical doctors at the 8 in the evening. And the political opposition proposed that 5 minutes after that, at the 8 and in the 5 minutes past 8 in the evening, people would express their disagreement with the handling of the pandemic by clapping, by hitting pans and pots and things like that on their windows. So I think that this was very interesting because we heard a lot about that. We in the Serbian team were researching cultures of rejection through the idea of anti-politics, and I would say that since the government used the pandemic as well as many other things to propagate their own, themselves, and used it as a kind of a campaign to present themselves as the saviors of the nation. People, in a way, the curfews and the isolation was felt as a kind of a physical manifestation of the atomization and the disappearances of the public sphere in Serbia, so people were protesting that in a way. And after that, of course, we had the elections in 2020, which happened right after the curfews and the isolation, when the COVID measures were relaxed or almost completely disappeared. So after the elections, when the party in power won the elections and won a lot of seats, people, since they announced that they will be, the curfews will start again because the infection rate got up. So people went out, and in July of 2020 we had very violent protests. In the people were trying to break into the public assembly, and of course the government reacted very violently. And in this case, these protests were not at least explicitly led by the political opposition. They were a kind of an amalgam of various different left-wing, right-wing ideas and movements who all congregated there in a kind of a violent manifestation of their disagreement with and themselves feeling that the government is using these COVID measures for their own benefit, cancelling them when it suits them to have the election, and then reinstalling them. So they felt that the party in power is misusing their power and their authority. These protests, there were strong right-wing elements there that were chanting things concerning the Kosovo situation, etc. So the protests were in a way a kind of a manifestation of this, of the public disagreement and the public dissatisfaction with the government itself. And I think that after that, the other, since the government didn't install those curfews and those measures, the next wave of protests happened at the beginning of 2021 when the vaccination started, and those protests were a part, I would say, those protests were more similar to regular anti-COVID, anti-vaccine protests in Europe and elsewhere. And they happened in March of 2020, and they were basically focused on protesting the vaccination itself, and were led, and of course protesting COVID measures, and they were organized and led by right-wing organization movements, but not the political parties, political opposition. And also there were a lot of anti-vax spokespeople present there that were famous even before the pandemic. And those protests were, in a way, to a certain extent, they were kind of ignored by the government, since the government didn't impose strict vaccination mandates, not even from the medical staff, because I think that in a way they knew about this, the general distrust that exists in Serbia concerning anything the state does. So they didn't want to, they learned their lesson in 2020, so they didn't want to agitate people to again protest, because the protests in 2020 were very violent, and there were talks even in other countries there, like online in newspapers, about the government oppression in Serbia. And so those protests in the March of 2021 were, you can hear various like conspiracy theories chants there, and banners against globalists, whatever, like deep state Satanists who sacrifice babies or whatever. And they were, to a certain extent, ignored, but also the government was ridiculing them in various media, calling them, claiming that they were not, that they were crazy, that the government did so much to acquire so many different types of vaccines, and they are actually irresponsible and not patriotic. And I would say that apart from that, the only other kind of protests, small protests, were in October of 2021 when COVID passes, the vaccine passes were installed in Serbia, but they were like really small, and like a few dozen people maybe gathered there. Even the anti-vax spokespeople and conspiracy theorists weren't present. So I would say that basically that's it. And as I mentioned, I think that as the case it is in Serbia, all of the protests were in a way a reaction to something the ruling party and the state did, and that they were overdetermined by this anti-political orientation of people and by the distrust in the state itself. But I think that the important thing to mention is that the government actually reacted to those protests and kind of, acted by taking into account all of these things. And that's why I think that, for example, in Serbia, even though we had like in the beginning of like March and April of 2021, we had like the biggest rate of vaccination in Europe for a short amount of time, but that stopped very soon as soon as people who wanted to get vaccinated did. So I think that actually shows that the government is working by having in mind the distrust that people have in it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Milan. Marko, Luka, from your perspective, from looking at the Croatian case, what do you think? Can you relate to this story, or where do you see things that were different, or was it similar?
Yeah, well, I can relate to a point in this sort of core motivation, both for the beginning of the sort of protest movement and the movement in general, but even more so for the sort of continuation through 2021 and 22 and now. With regards to sort of this sort of deep distrust of state, of institutions in general, of state institutions, but also of sort of global institutions, of scientific institutions and so forth, which are sort of at the core. This distrust of institutions appears to be at the core of the movement itself. That said, the sort of in Croatia the protest started as quite sort of really diverse sort of consisted of diverse communities which all basically reacted to, since Croatian government largely tried to avoid sort of harsher lockdowns and curfews, they sort of went for really ad hoc sort of measures which basically aggravated a lot of communities, especially when it comes to sort of economic anxiety, when it comes to distrust of the governing party. And so sort of these communities, so to speak, people who were motivated by this distrust of the governing party and sort of strong economic anxiety were also a large part of the initial movement, along with the sort of libertarians and conspiracy theorists and far right. So it was a really sort of mixed bag, which sort of started articulating in 2020 and early 21 towards this sort of conspirituality, this sort of new age meets conspiracy theory crowd. But even this sort of waned with time as sort of a one political party decided to take over, to become the sort of face of protest against corona measures. And this political party, the bridge most in Croatian, was essentially sort of represented a new kind of right wing for Croatia, in the sense of being a much more sort of focused on trying to avoid explicit far right imagery or rhetoric, while the sort of far right party was quite split on the protest and internally, and part of the far right was even very much pro vaccines, and they even had this. One of them had even this speech, "Since when are we for choice? Since when are we for freedom?" So, yeah, and sort of this is essentially a new kind of, for Croatia, a new kind of right-wing populist party, also in the sense of avoiding the sort of tropes, but also in the sense of being extremely sort of social media savvy and having this sort of very personalized sort of political strategies in actually trying to mobilize people against corona measures, against the government, and so forth, and fundamentally against institutions, but also in a way promising their own experts taking over once they are in power. So this is also sort of something that might come up later.
Yes, thank you. Benny, you have research on the Austrian case. At least looking from Germany to Austria, we somehow I had the feeling that Vienna became to something like the European capital of anti-corona protests. Is this picture wrong, or what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's usually not a good sign when people look to Vienna from Germany in political terms. No, it really is an extraordinary story given that the political culture in Austria for the past, I'd say, 50, 60 years was one where social movements, street protests did not really feature prominently. Austria has for a long time been characterized by a kind of consensual politics, by a relatively weak civil society when it comes to mobilization, street protests. Especially so as the far right and the populist far right in Austria, as you may know, has been and still is dominated by one party, the Freedom Party, which had a kind of avant-garde role ever since the late 1980s in European far-right populism. And one of the things that's interesting about this party is that they largely refrained from mobilizing on the street, which is also something I think that distinguishes them from neo-fascist parties. They have been very much focused on parliamentary politics and media strategies, starting from like classical media strategies in the 1990s, then kind of pioneering social media strategies for the far right. So one of the interesting things during the pandemic was that this changed in a sense that the Freedom Party, which itself was in a deep internal crisis just before the pandemic happened. They had a large corruption scandal. They were basically kicked out of a coalition government that they had been part of for 2 years before that. And at some point, and after some, after a short period of, I'd say, disorientation, where they did not really know how to react, as most, I think, political forces did not really know how to react to the pandemic and to the new emerging questions and forces and dynamics. But at some point in the second half of 2020, they decided to go all in and to support these protests. And it's really the first time that the Freedom Party has become a mass mobilizing force in Austrian politics. And this, among other things, has led to these really, really large protests that were characterized, and that did not only happen in the capital, in Vienna, but really emerged and popped up really in a lot of like mid-sized cities and towns and also in the Austrian countryside. And in a lot of places where the Freedom Party did not have a mobilizing role, but where you could really see that this was at least partly locally organized mobilizations with some, we would call it probably grassroots elements, usually with some far-right organizations, sometimes linked to the Freedom Party, but sometimes also outside of their sphere of influence, being present. But it was and remained, I think, a very mixed political composition. And then you had these really huge demonstrations in Austria for a while, where the Freedom Party did feature very prominently, also defying police bans. So it was basically, I mean, this was a matter of mass civil disobedience. You had 50,000 people, 70,000 people on the streets of Vienna defying a police ban in a demonstration that was organized and led by members of parliament, by the Freedom Party, but which was quite obviously, I would say, able to mobilize much more people and way beyond their usual spectrum and their usual followers. So in this case, yes, you could probably say that Austria, the Austrian case is an interesting one as a kind of outlier, or as maybe an extreme case. But in some other ways, it did connect, of course, with mobilizations in different parts of Europe. Quite obviously in Germany, where but again, with the difference that I think in Germany, and Alex will talk about this, I think, in a second, but the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, had a more ambivalent role in these protests. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Do you quickly want to read? I think we can turn back then to this question when we talk about the institutions. But this is actually the second topic I would really like to address then. I mean, you have showed in your accounts until now that some protests did actually, they related somehow to state decisions, to measures imposed by the state, and were processed through and by institutions. And on the other hand, also established parties played, at some points in some protests at least, played a crucial role. Celina, when you look at the Swedish case, how was the situation there? Which role did the state or institution play in this protest, and were there any signs of institutionalization of the protests you have, I don't know, observed?
Well, for the case of Sweden, it was really different, I would say. So we didn't really have, I mean, the Swedish government and the political parties were kind of, they agreed on that the virus was a threat, so this wasn't really a problem. And we did have a lot of very kind of voluntary strategy, and we had rather like recommendations rather than like we didn't have any lockdowns. We only had like a lot of recommendations. So the state didn't really, I mean, we didn't really have a political party who joined the protests, and the protest came very, very late in comparison to the other countries. So our protest started in 2021, and this was because we had a new law, the Corona law, and this was a decision, and it was a preliminary law. So the reactions were, they started there. And they were like, we had different individuals from Alternative for Sweden, we had different individuals from the Nordic resistance movement, but we did not have, I mean, official political parties joining the movement until January 2022, when the Nordic resistance movement actually joined one of the biggest demonstrations that we had with 10,000 people. As to your question about if there was sign of institutionalization, I would say that the kind of the key figures in these protests started a political party, but it's very, very small. It's called Rikslagen, which I don't really know how to translate it, but it's like it's pointing to like governmental law, and they are their key issues are truth and justice. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, when you look on the German case, I mean, there, I think Ben is already related to the AfD. They had an ambivalent perspective, at least at the beginning, but there were also strong processes of institutionalization, I would say. Looking at, we also already had talked about the Freie Sachsen, Free Saxons, which were something like the institutionalization during this process. Can you, what is your perspective on this process regarding the German case?
Sure. Yeah, it's. I think what's really interesting, and I think this is something that that Power, with a colleague, has also, I think, worked out for the case of Leipzig, is that in Germany it appears that there are phases of institutionalization and shifts sort of within the protest dynamics, where their start was basically after like this phase of fairly local organization. The their start was basically mediated through a self-institutionalized, I don't know, I wouldn't know what to call it, like a Verein, like an association that was called Querdenken, lateral thinking. And it had a, I would say, very contemporary way of working, because it was in essence, it was a franchise model. Querdenken was run by one guy, an investor coming from southern Germany, who basically decided that this would be the moment to start a movement against these measures for a sort of like vague conception of freedom, which we might touch on later, and who would then also start to supply branding and start to supply a kind of like calendar and platform for other local branches that could then also claim to be part of this movement of lateral thinkers. And this became, in the course of 2020, so big that the term Querdenken is synonymous with this movement, I think, in the popular discourse. But either depending on sort of like shifts in the government response to the virus that loosened up somewhat throughout 2020, or at least was distributed more along sort of like the individual states rather than on the federal level, this movement waned, and it also broke apart due to some sort of like internal conflicts that had to do with the fact that quite clearly the guy running it was monetizing this movement, and it was also not really cohesive in terms of its ideologies. And what came then, and this is something that Paul talked about, was that the protest focus shifted, and more radical actors, such as the Free Saxons, became visible, and I think they were founded in early 21 or maybe even in 2020 already. But those actors sort of like began becoming sort of like the face in a way of the protests currently. But there are the Free Saxons, they're like a micro party, right? They do try to sort of like enter the traditional field of politics in a way. But there were attempts also in preparation for the German federal election in 21 to build a party that came out of the lateral movement called Die Basis. There were multiple attempts to do this, and they all failed. But they spoke in a way to the ideas of this movement, because they very strongly advertised technological infrastructures as a basis for like a better consensus building. They had all these terms such as awareness, swarm intelligence, but then also like spiritual terms such as like self-care that like provided the pillars for their thinking. They didn't enter the parliament. They had regionally like in some cases, surprisingly high voting rates, but I doubt that this will be the form of institutionalization. I fear that it's much more likely that actors such as the Free Saxons sort of like will continue these sort of like this protest tradition. And I think that if you think about all of these digital channels and the communication channels and the groups that have emerged either on Telegram but also on other alternative platforms as institutions, I think there is also an argument to be made that there exists a now sort of like more advanced digital ecosystem that sort of like has expanded its reach and that has definitely drawn more people into it than it did before during sort of previous waves of right-wing protests.
Yeah, you just related to the question of right-wing protests. Perhaps we could just do a quick round, and all of you quickly, respond to in a not too long manner what role the far right played in this. Were really far right protests? How did they relate to it, and how did far right organizations relate to these protests? Perhaps we just can quickly go through and have a short, brief pictures on the situations.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I would say that compared to the other countries, the case of Serbia is in a way more simple, but in other ways a little more complex, because as I mentioned to Manuela when we were talking 2 days ago, like the ruling party in Serbia is like the Borg in Star Trek, because they assimilate everything. And if the movements and the parties that were, for example, active in those the protest, for example, in July of 2020, they were those parts of the right-wing movements in Serbia that were not assimilated, that are oriented against the ruling party, and they actually, you can see in those protests that precisely because of that, those protests weren't in any way formally organized. They were like an outburst of violence that those movements tried to direct and to use it and to aim it to show their dissatisfaction. It's precisely for that reason that those protests were against new COVID measures, but people were chanting about Kosovo or something. And in the March of 2021, those who led those protests were also, there were the right-wing movements in Serbia that, claimed to be like sovereignists, anti-globalists, etc., that sound, similar to populist right-wing in other countries or in the US, for example, and a lot of them use these ideas and these symbols that even come from like the online sphere, like QAnon stuff, etc. So I think that those protests were led by, not assimilated by the party in power parts of the right wing, but they're not institutionalized in that way. So they're not organized, they're not formally connected in any way between each other in a sense that they present a coherent political power that people can actually support for either during formal elections or even that they present any kind of new different alternative policies for Serbia. They are more like expressions of dissatisfaction that are in like this postmodern way. They're just like a network that just appears sometimes, but I'm not sure that they actually present an important actor in the political sphere currently.
Yeah, I mean, I just touched on it. I think, and again, this is something that both of you have also worked out. I think that in Germany there are regional differences that really do play a role, especially between the south of Germany and then parts of the east of Germany, where you can see that in some cases the far right has been active, like the organized far right has been active within these movements from the very beginning, and in some cases you see them sort of appropriating the movement. But what's always sort of like been an issue is that it's like these protests even in sort of like southern Western Germany have always been open to this sort of alliance. And from early on, sort of like the first big demonstrations, you had all of these, spiritualist, esoteric, maybe even libertarian actors, but you also had not only sort of like self-proclaimed patriots, but I mean real sort of like folkish type white Europe type of well, real far righters, and I mean in their symbolism and in their rhetoric as well. This wasn't something that was hidden at these demonstrations. So then it becomes really hard. I mean, you can like sort of recognize these actors within the protests and within the concrete demonstrations, but it starts to become really difficult to draw these boundaries between sort of like what is part of the organized far right and where do these ideologies begin to sort of like get blurry. I mean, we had a bunch of QAnon protesters, for example, and Trumpists present at the protests in Berlin. And it's really hard to locate them within sort of like a German frame of reference, right? Just to touch because it's also the far right, but the parliamentary far right, to touch on the AfD, I would just say, I think in opposition to Austria, the AfD has an ongoing conflict within it, with regards to its relationship to protest movements, and there are wings within the AfD that are looking at cooperating, and there are those that are trying to keep their distance. And I think that this is something that has continued throughout this pandemic, that some parts have at points sort of collaborated, but in general there's a division between the sort of like more radical parts of the AfD who are looking at a cooperation with these protests, and those who are trying to sort of retain a semblance of, you know, like a bourgeois civility.
Well, as I said before, the far right didn't really have like a big connections to the movement in Sweden. But except the Nordic resistance movement that came afterwards. So I think, I'm not going to say much because I don't have much to say about this, but I think what's interesting, or what would be relevant for my research or for Sweden is to look into how these, I guess, leftist, or the ones who are talking about peace and love, and we have a lot of those in our movements, and how come that they find themselves together in a demonstration in Stockholm together with the Nordic resistance movement, and with them having a really big banner there. So I think this is something interesting that we have to look into, and that goes back to the question that Manuela started with, the question about conditions of acceptability.
Well, far-right unofficial groups were always there at the protests, and they were always sort of, they had the biggest banner and they were the loudest, and media tended to focus on them a lot, but they were always just a part of a larger sort of movement. So this is one thing. The other thing is this esoteric sort of QAnon hippie far-right, which was basically, which is, I mean, as Milan said, it's sort of, it has the same, it is essentially disorganized, this sort of fragmented, specific people who have these beliefs and so forth, but they are never sort of, they don't appear to present any sort of relevant political force, or even have any tendency actually to organize into such a force. And I think in Croatian case, the most interesting again is this sort of far-right populist, or a right-wing populist with a sort of hidden far-right agenda, so to speak, who tend to work the sort of the dissatisfaction of the population, who tend to work the sort of popular points in the conversation, in the general conversation, the general sort of economic anxiety, and to also work the sort of nationalist tropes, but always in this sort of always with the hand behind their back in a way. So I think that these are the most, and these are the parliamentary party, and I think these are by far the most sort of dangerous consequence of their sort of possibility of gaining more voters on respect of these conditions is the most dangerous aspect of in Croatia, I think.
Thanks. Three quick things to add to what I just said before. One is that apart from, I briefly mentioned this, but I think it bears, it's worth repeating that apart from the Freedom Party, some smaller groups of openly fascist, neo-fascist, and Nazi groups were present in these protests from the very beginning, and they really saw this as an opportunity to present themselves and to be on the street in ways that they haven't been able to do in decades. Like the most prominent neo-Nazi who spent quite a few years in prison actually, and is I mean, you could see him on the demonstration. This would not have been possible before. If this opportunity really translates into strengthening their cause and their organizations, is I think still open. So we don't really know that, but at least they're trying. The second thing to note is that the Freedom Party, so as I mentioned, it really represents a shift in their attitude towards street mobilizations and street politics, that they decided to really not only participate but try to hegemonize this movement. What is still unclear to me and many other analysts, I think, is whether this represents more than a tactical and instrumentalist approach. Because as I mentioned, the Freedom Party was in a deep internal crisis, and it's quite clear that their now sole leader, former Minister of the Interior, Herbert Kickl, really saw this as a window of opportunity to strengthen his own position within the party and also to regain momentum politically in the broader sense. If this reliance on street politics and mobilization transforms the political nature of this party, which is, I think, a possibility, or if this remains a purely tactical and instrumentalist approach, I think is still to be seen. And we will see that, I think, in the coming months, when the protests, this is at least what I expected, when the protests will regain momentum, when we will have when the government will reintroduce measures, during the winter, when the rate of infection the numbers of infections will go up again. So this is that. And the third aspect that I haven't talked about yet is that there is one new political force that has emerged directly out of these protests. In some senses, similar to what Alex just described with Die Basis. It's a party called MFG, Menschen, Freiheit, Grundrechte, Humans, Freedom, Basic Rights. And it managed to be quite successful in one regional election where they got something like 8% of the vote and became part of the parliament, and in national polls they're now, they've been at something like 10-11%, but and it went down a little bit in the past months, but they would, if we would have snap elections tomorrow, they would most certainly be part of the next parliament. And they are a more, they do not represent themselves as part of the right. Even though some of the key members have a political history of being part of the far right. But they really try to hide that. And and not just that, but also parts of the cadre and parts of the people who got mobilized by this and who are now actively engaged in this new political party, they themselves don't see they don't see themselves as part of the right. They are okay with working with the right. They are okay with some of the policies, or at least they don't care. But it's an interesting and I think complicated case, and I think it's something that we see in many different places, where the political spectrum itself becomes more difficult to read. So that's that.
Yeah, thank you to all of you to give us this overview on the situation of the far right in the context of these COVID-19 protests. So looking at the time, I think I would like to go on to the third question that's actually standing a bit in the room, and you have, Celina, have already actually addressed with this question of the conditions of acceptability. What were the motives and reasons behind these protests? I think you had written this paper where you have emphasized the question of hyper-individualism. Yesterday we had the term of selfishness. Christine Henschel, she also argues, for example, that this idea of freedom that is promoted in these protests is something that is deeply selfish, because it's a freedom of to just do whatever you want and what you have done before without accepting it as something like a society. But yeah, Alex, could you perhaps elaborate for the German case on the motives and things that lay behind these protests?
Sure. I'll try. Also relying on my co-panelists probably, because there are some things I think that are eerily similar across sort of like all of our cases, and then of course there are sort of like these national or regional specialties. And I do think that what Christina Henschel is writing, and it comes up in I think what Celina said and what Benny mentioned with Menschenfreiheit, Grundrechte, and the Free Saxons. I mean, there is this incredible reliance on the language of freedom and the language of liberation in a way. And the first really big protests in Germany that took place in August of 2020, first federal protests where everybody came together, and it was sort of like this surreal festival situation where you had representatives of the far right, but also sort of like hippie-esque families in sandals and socks walking along each other. That was like called the Day of Freedom. The pandemic is over. This is the Day of Freedom. Also a uncanny reminder of Leni Riefenstahl's film that is also called Tag der Freiheit, propaganda movie. And it seems that, at least in these protests, like most of the things that that emerge there as objects of rejections are sort of like all of these measures that that enter everyday life, such as mask wearing, the vaccines, the social distancing rules, the economic issues that are definitely a part of sort of like this pandemic situation remain quite unaddressed, at least in the rhetoric. It was my experience from sort of like watching these protests and doing some of this research online. And sort of like it goes along with what we already heard, this broad rejection of institutions, of media institutions, of political institutions, of certain kinds of scientific institutions, but then also of the pharmaceutical industry regarding vaccines, and also sort of like we could call it sort of like the social media industry. I mean, there is a lot of sort of like backlash, of course, against sort of like mainstream media, but then also against Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, who started enacting all sorts of regulation that, you know, much more people than before actually sort of like fell victim to. They got banned because they said, I'm not going to get vaccinated, and that might have been their first ban by Facebook. I think this term of freedom, and what Henschel and then others write about sort of like the selfishness, is true to a degree, that there is this moment, what we saw, or what I saw in the research, of a sort of hyper individual focus on self-determination, on individual sovereignty that involves questions of bodily autonomy, very sort of largely in regards to the vaccination, through adapting slogans like "My body, my choice," or through sort of this image of the immune system, that you take care of yourself and that you maintain yourself, and that would help sort of protect you against the pandemic. And there is this logic, of course, of ownership in there, but there's also a logic of refusal of a collective solution of the crisis, and of sort of like the interrelation of your own health with that of broader society. There is a second dimension, I think, that involves more these epistemic dimensions, namely how your own perspective and how your own feelings come to be valued in the face of what experts are telling you, what the government is telling you, what the media is telling you. And I think there's a moment of this personal, very individualized epistemology going on that either focuses on doing your own research and then, in the worst case, drifting off into sort of like these conspirational bubbles, or really relying on a very personal and limited, in a way, sort of like focus on your own experience, on your own feelings, and on your own intuition that is sort of like valued against what everyone else is saying and telling you. And I think there is a third thing that I find interesting and that maybe could also be discussed, that we found in Germany as an element of this sort of like freedom and drive to individualism. And it is that, of course, there is a moment of personal distinction in sort of like the gesture of resistance, right? There is a gesture of not being like those sheeple, not being like those people following sort of like the official narratives. And there's a very strong desire to highlight and perform a kind of singular uniqueness within the protesters, but also within these online spaces that that we looked at. So there is always also, yes, a performative aspect, I think, to this sort of resistance. And maybe it adds something to this question of, okay, is this only a logic of ownership and a sort of like neoliberal logic of sort of taking care of yourself, refusing all sort of like solidaristic dependence within society? That's one of the arguments that Henschel makes, but that's also the definition of ugly freedoms by Elizabeth Anker, for example. But I think it speaks to a broader concern with individual autonomy and with sort of like the borders of you know, of the body and the subject in a way in the situation of the pandemic, where these things really have to be renegotiated, and also are renegotiated through sort of like new ways of governing and new ways of looking at sort of like politics.
Thank you, Alex. To Celina, as you have brought up the question of the conditions of acceptability, I know you said that you would wish to do more research on this, but have you got ideas what is this condition in this situation you have observed?
The conditions of acceptability of the movements in Sweden. Yeah, well, I think people are kind of sick and tired. I mean, they feel that some things are changing and they don't really know what it is. And I think it's really, really easy to just find a kind of scapegoat and point to that. It could be, I mean, it could sometimes be the migrant, it could sometimes be the pandemic. But then again, I think Sweden, or the Swedish government, has had a rough time handling crisis as well. So I mean, this should also be brought up, and it hasn't really gone as planned. So for example, we should have had a lot of like masks, but we burned it up a couple of years before the pandemic. And these are all like a lot of scandals that kind of come to the fore eventually. And so I think there's like a lot of reasons to why people feel like or find these kind of conditions of acceptability. But I also think there's a lot of frustration, and we were also doing interviews, as you know, with workers in retail and logistics, and a lot of people there pointed to, I mean, very stressful work, bad working conditions, and etc. And not enough time to spend with friends and family. Not enough time to sleep, not enough time to, or having to choose with your hobby or sleep. So I mean, there's a lot of different things that kind of, I guess, come together, and I feel, or this could, I mean, there's so many different answers, I think, to these conditions of acceptability. We also have a lot of what Alex mentioned. These conspiracy theories, which also kind of come in and give a very, very well narration or perspective of like what could be what's it called? Why everything is wrong, or just like a story that tells something, and then eventually, I guess, you believe it in some ways, or there are different conditions for that. So maybe not a straightforward answer, but I feel like it's a lot of different things that comes together.
Yeah, thank you. I think one topic that this hasn't been put forward until now in this situation is also the question of the outside. I think, Milan, you have raised this question in this preliminary interview we have made, and I mean, we find this picture of the outside of the elites, you know, of also in these anti-Semitic stories. But perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on the role of the outside in the protests here, because I think it's an important aspect.
Yeah, I think that relates to something Alex was saying. This, for example, what I forgot to mention. So let's say the most coherently organized movement which has participated in the protests against the vaccination is the organization that called Dosta je bilo. The translation would be "Enough is enough" or something. And they began as neoliberal technocrats, basically. And a few years ago, they changed their narrative, and they had an internal change, and they adopted this kind of sovereignist, protectionist ideas, similar to, let's say, American Republicans or something. And I think that that actually is illustrative of this idea that these protests, so in our context, in the Serbian context, were presented as protests against something that is being imposed from the outside, which isn't truly ours. And this idea that because, of course, of a lot of the conditions, economic instability, poverty, political instability, dysfunctioning institutions, all of those problems are being projected onto something that is being presented as coming from the outside, from either outside of our borders, outside of this our true spirit of our nation, or of our tradition, etc., from the globalist elites, from the United States, from the NATO, from the EU, etc. All of those conditions are being projected as being caused by this unknown cause, and now, of course, we are rising up against that cause. Of course, not perceiving that, of course, that cause is connected with some internal contradictions, and in that sense, like it's like those, like the vaccination, the anti-COVID measures, and the virus itself is being presented as something infecting our national body, our pure national soul, which is now being corrupted. And I think it has this kind of individualist idea that now we are rising up to fight that because we want to be true to ourselves, we want to be true to our, protect our the body of of the individual is being presented as connected to the body of the nation in that sense, and it's this putting these walls to protect ourselves. And I think that it's interesting how it has this kind of it has a certain kind of libertarian twist to it, like don't tread on me idea, and I think that it's not surprising that an organization like Dosta je bilo, which were neoliberal oriented, adopted these ideas and tried to propagate them, and presenting the vaccination and the vaccine itself as something that shouldn't be trusted. And it's interesting that they actually proposed that they would accept the vaccine if our government organizations would test them out. So it has to go through our ways of testing, because they can't be trusted, because they're coming from the outside. So we have to protect ourselves because of that.
Yeah, thank you, Milan. So we're coming to an end, and in order to wrap up, yeah, please. Sure.
Apologies. Just one more thing on top of everything that has been said, which is also the case for Croatia, not to sort of reiterate everything. I just want to sort of add one more condition of acceptability, which I think is relevant. And this is the answer of the political and academic and media elites to the movement, which has been indeed feeding more or less, of course there are nuances, but in large part has been feeding into the narrative which the protest movement has started with. This idea, I mean, the answer of political and media and academic elites has, not of course all of it, but in some significant part been this answer of a patronizing, semi-technocratic way of ordering the society, and these people are all basically insane. And I think that this has in large part also sort of contributed to the continuation, and will sort of contribute, will be one of the things that will probably stay the most in the sort of future developments of the thing, where I think that one of the greatest threats is of these sort of competing, depoliticized, quasi-technocratic political options. On one hand, the sort of right-wing populists with their experts, and they also have experts. They're not against science as a whole, they're just against this specific institutionalist science. They have their own experts. And on the other hand of this sort of, however you want to call it, neoliberal technocratic elites, which also have this idea of voters and the people are all basically misinformed, and we cannot trust them anymore, and we have to put the governance into the hands of the sort of superior expertise people. So I think this is the sort of future threat. This is the political landscape which is the sort of greatest threat from what I can see from the corona crisis.
Yeah, please.
Just to pick up on this, because I think it's very important, and it's also one of the longer-term trends, one of the trends that go way back and way before the pandemic, and in this sense constitutes one element of the conditions of acceptability of what we are now seeing, the role of expertise in politics. And I've learned a lot from a book I've read last year by Jill Eyal, the Crisis of Expertise, where he describes what he calls the expertization of politics, and how the expertization of politics, that is the increasing reliance on this idea of a neutral technocratic expertise by governments, and how this expertization of politics inevitably leads to a politicization of expertise. And this is something that you could witness long before the pandemic, but the pandemic really was a catalyst for this. And I think what we are seeing in these movements is a certain type of politicization of expertise. It's a type that we don't necessarily like, but it is related to other forms of politicization of expertise that historically was part of the left when it comes to, say, genetic engineering, to nuclear power, to climate politics. I mean, I say, the political left has a long track record of trying to politicize expertise, questions of science, and not to rely on this naive idea of science and expertise as something that stands outside of society and outside of politics, and that provides us with a neutral kind of compass. And the situation in the pandemic now is that with these movements, and with the pandemic, and with the pandemic management introduced by many of the kind of centrist governments in Europe, we now have a situation where increasingly left and liberal forces fall back on this naive idea and defend science and defend expertise. Listen to the experts, which I think is troublesome.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. You somehow already linked to the question I wanted to ask. So what will come next and what will remain? So as you somehow have answered already without me asking, I quickly want to have you three also giving a brief answers to this so that we can have this picture and then perhaps open the floor for other 15 minutes and have a brief discussion. But first, yeah, what will remain?
Well, speaking from the Serbian context and connecting to what Luka and Benny said, you know, in Serbia, I think one of the big and important problems which tend to happen usually like coming from this, you know, sphere of civil society is this idea that, you know, people believe in these things, people, you know, behave this way because this patronizing way that Luka mentioned, you know, just because they are, you know, dumb nationalist right-wingers and, you know, we need to explain, even not explain, it's just, you know, behaving and talking like it's those people's fault. They don't trust the science, they don't believe in science, they are uneducated, and, you know, it's hopeless, it's, you know, that kind of patronizing way. And I think that has an adverse effect because it tends to drive people further from us, from our ideas for what we try to present. And I think what's important is, and I think that our project contributes to that, is to try to understand why those ideas, those conspiracies, those narratives, why do they make sense for those people? Because they do. For them, you know, like in a Foucauldian way, they are true for them. They are a regime of truth through which they understand their reality, in which they are, you know. And we need to understand from their perspective, you know, why does it make sense for someone to believe that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden sacrifice babies to Satan? I mean, it sounds horrible, but, you know, it's for someone it does make sense, and someone is behaving in accordance to those narratives. And I think that in a way it's our job as, you know, intellectuals or whatever, is to understand that and to try to approach to those people from their, you know, from their world, their life world in a way, and to understand why those narratives are acceptable to them and why other narratives aren't.
So. I don't know what's coming next. I mean, I don't know. It's, I mean, I can only say what I'm worried about. And I think there's, it feels like these, at least in Germany, these protests, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about the outside, Milan, and then I think also in regards to sort of like expert politics. But it feels to me, although we've seen in Germany similar sorts of protests before, there are lineages to protests by Pegida in 2015, even sort of like the anti-war or peace protests in 2014 that were about the annexation of the Crimea. It seems like these current protests are like a way of dealing with like a fairly large shift or transformation that sort of like we've seen people think about in sort of like the interviews and the field work that we did before the pandemic started, that had to do with certain kinds of anxiety about what was going to come. These are people that were sort of like preoccupied with how their work is going to change through the introduction of new technologies, how their lives are going to change through sort of like the introduction of new work rhythms. And there was, and Dania mentioned this feeling of unease about the future and about sort of like what was to come. And it feels like all of these conspiratorial narratives about sort of like the Great Reset, or the sort of like the big plans for sort of like for the next, I don't know how many years, they seem to be a way of yeah, anticipating a change to come that's definitely going to be bad, and turning it, or sort of like responding to it in this very sort of like individualized, focused on individual sovereignty sort of like way that seems hard to place within sort of like the spectrum, the political spectrum that we have. And I fear that going into the climate crises or going into sort of like future crises, even geopolitical crises as sort of the current ones, that this is a response that might grow stronger because the sort of like government responses to these crises, you know, they might sort of like have a different, a similar form to the one that we're currently seeing, that sort of are going to go against certain ideas of sovereignty, individual freedom that have so long been held very dear. So I don't see exactly this movement continuing, but I see sort of like these ideological strands become stronger.
Well, for Sweden, the movement wasn't really that strong, but I do think that they did a really good job with kind of planting a seed for fear or skepticism amongst the general public, I guess. So I think this is something that might grow. It doesn't mean that the movement will grow, but I do think that people they won't be looking at science in the same way, or expertise in the same way, or politicians in the same way. So I think this is something that we will have to kind of carry on with us. I think also the pandemic has shown that the Swedish government wasn't really ready for such a crisis, which also helps with the kind of fear and skepticism. But I don't know, we'll see. We'll have an election in September, so I think hopefully we'll, know more by then. Get more answers to where we are really heading.
Yeah, thank you all of you to this discussion. I think as far as yeah, please. As far as I have the time in mind, we can have an open debate until 1 o'clock, so other 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm not sure. Perhaps somebody who has the timetable in its hand could, okay, I get the sign, it's okay. So please, if there are any comments, questions, broader pictures, or...
Thank you so much. This was an incredible round. Thank you. It was really great listening to you and hearing these different, accounts that at the same time work so well together. And it's very difficult to respond because there are so many aspects. So I will not do just to all the great insights that you gave, but. I have a feeling that there is something that hasn't been mentioned, also because it wasn't part of your research, but that seems really important to me, and I wonder how you would see this. So you were looking very closely into these protest movements, right, and how they basically make sense of this. This is what you also said, Milan, right now. Okay, so. But this also relates to their lives, right? And what they do, and what they were able to do, and what they were not able to do anymore. And we are now in this in-between phase, as you mentioned, Benjamin. So we're not out. We will probably, we'll be deep back in by autumn, by the time of autumn. And but there is a sense that somehow we've overcome this pandemic at the moment. At least we're all behaving like that's the fact, right? But people are really, really different now. everyone is very different now, and everyone went through an incredibly long time of a reconfiguration of social relations, for which there was a deep sense that the ways we are being governed doesn't make sense to us either, right? I mean, that I think is the whole narrative about the climate crisis. We know it doesn't make sense what's going on, right? It's the same with the war. That okay, for I know a lot of people who think that makes sense, but it's definitely an incredibly destructive force which has come to the fore, and which is adding up on the other destructive forces that we need to confront. And we have that sense that the governing forces are not really responding to it, right? And at the same time, what I got as an impression from what you said when you listen to it in a more, you know, like if you put it together, then it seems that these movements, if they had one effect, then this was the destruction of social relations as they have been before, in a time where these have been destroyed, right? I mean, they have definitely been put to a halt in a way that enabled the continuation, the routine, the reproduction of, you know, by at the same time pretending that, you know, we are still reproducing what we've done before. So that moment in between, and that moment that seems to not, that doesn't really relate to what, you know, these practices are, that have to change, in my opinion, in order to do what Milan has said. You know, if we are to reorganize these meanings, then also the practices have to change. Right? I mean, they have to be different. We have to behave different. We cannot keep up with what has been before. So then, is there something to learn? Are there any cracks that you see that could become informative for such a way out? Because otherwise, you know, we just move into the next step of this agony.
Do you want to? It looks like
I mean, my short response would be yes to the last, to the very last thing you said. But I wanted to mention maybe one thing in response to your comment, which is I think what we've seen in the past 2 years in these movements, and also in the kind of the wider cultural sphere, or the wider sphere of sociality that was kind of maybe not part of the movement, but somehow influenced by some of the ideas and sentiments and affects and emotions. I think what we've seen there is just, you know, it really is a glimpse into a future in which modes of living will have to be transformed in one way or the other, and in which, as it stands, the state will play a significant role, and a more significant role in the lives of individual people when it comes to economic crises, you know, raging inflation, prices of food and energy, shortages, rationing, when it comes, of course, to everything related to the climate crisis. I mean, these, because we are not in a position of a democratic collective community where we could kind of self-impose consciously new ways of living. You know, we're not there. This will be, in one way or the other, happen as a wild mixture of policies and measures that will be introduced and imposed by the state. And we've lived through a brief era now of experiencing what it means when the state, in a very practical, concrete way, intervenes in the lives of people who are not used to be policed in that way, who are not migrants, who are not minorities, who are not, it affected parts of the population who usually only deal with the state when they have to do their taxes or when they're driving, when they're speeding on the motorway. And then all of a sudden it was the state telling them, you stay at home, you cannot meet your grandparents, you cannot do this and that. And what we saw was parts of, I think that was a reaction to that. And this is what worries me, that this, we now have a pattern and experiences of how people think they should or can or might react to such experiences, and they will only, even if the pandemic was over tomorrow, we would still have to expect experiences like that. And this I think is something to bear in mind for the future.
I wanted to add something. So I think you're right that in mentioning that the pandemic has changed. It's a big change, but I think that what we should be wary of, and that's just my opinion, is this, that whoever we are, like someone who was against these kind of protest movements, right-wing movements, conspiracy movements, as Benny mentioned, have a lot of time the answer was just trust the experts, and which is of course fine, and I'm not an epidemiologist so that I can say whether there were other ways of governing the situation of the pandemic. But personally, I think what was a big problem that these movements answered was that the lockdowns, the curfews, etc., were a form of extreme isolation and a disappearance of this kind of substance of social life, like meeting each other, hanging out, going out, etc. And that a lot of these movements were capturing the feeling that people, of course, wanted those things back. And I think, I'm saying this because, for example, I saw that some people online were proposing that we have climate change lockdowns. So because, of course, the climate change is coming, we should have lockdowns to stop people from moving unnecessarily. And a lot of people were, because of the pandemic, we had some debates, do we need, for example, like universities, like do we need people going to university? I mean, we can have all of this online, right? And of course, I was horrified by that because, like, if I were going online for 4 years to the university, I would kill myself probably, because the point of going to the university is the experience. And as Benny mentioned, the government had to stop people from meeting their grandparents, their family for holidays, etc. And I think that our answer can't be that. What we need is to imagine, we need a change, but we need to keep this the element of social life, which provides, basically provides meaning to people. And these movements are doing that. They're saying you just need to protest, we can go back, and our new meaning will be nation, patriarchy, whatever, like our race, etc. And I think that we are failing to do that because the situation of the pandemic showed, of course, you have epidemiologists, you have experts, their answer was this, you need a lockdown. And for example, in Serbia, after the lockdown was, after the curfews were lifted, after you had the end of 2020, where you had the biggest number of people in the hospitals, etc., you had a kind of a lockdown. Everyone who could work from home were sent home, etc. But you have to ask yourself, what about people who have kids who can't go to school, but the companies, etc., those people had to go to work. So what are we giving to these people? How are they going to solve that problem? Just saying because we have high infection rates, we need a lockdown isn't a solution, isn't a long-term solution. And I think we failed in imagining a solution which which could be otherwise. And I'm not an expert and I can't imagine it right now, but I think that that's something that we need to do.
So there are two more questions in the room. I will slightly overgo my role and give a very brief answer too, because I've been conducting interviews again after, just at the moment, and it really struck me when I asked the people what has changed during the pandemic, they barely can give an answer. So I think they also lack a language to describe what's happening to them and what has happened, and I think that will deepen the problem. That's all what I wanted to say. So first here and then here.
Thanks a lot. I've been following your work, of course, from the beginning. And now Manuela started with the systemic crisis. Now we are back. Maybe not in the same words that Wallenstein described it, but it is systemic. And our more or less, now do not consider it as a description. It's more of a modality of thinking, analyzing, our bubbling, and like going through the tunnel of finding the meaning brought us also in something that I noticed as a leftist response to finding the meaning is providing all the way a second-degree meaning, developing irony, developing sarcasm, developing something which is not taking the stance here and now, but projecting what if and conditionality of that what if. We are lost, and as such, the first thing to do will be just to enroot yourself where you are in the moment that is happening. And the thinking of pandemics, it's firstly endemic. It's not anymore pandemic. It's not something that happened and then is gone, or the crisis is behind us. We are living with that. You have a simple cough and then, well, let's see my temperature, let's see that and that. Oh, let's test, because it's a vegetative reaction to the crisis, to what is going on. And my question to all of you from each of your perspective would be not on the rational level of thinking the endemics, COVID, whatsoever, but touching upon the emotional fluency or literacy, emotional literacy among people that you observed, engaged with, to just give a brief response as researchers, as observers, as those who were in the field, either digital or the spatial one. What was your first reaction to this emotional fluency that you've received through their reactions?
I would suggest collect the second question, and then brief answers, and then to...
Okay. No, I just wanted to add two things. First, we had an Indian sociologist at our research institute. She's a prominent Indian senior sociologist, and she gave a talk on the pandemic in India, which was, I mean, I've read and talked and heard so much about the pandemic in the US, in Sweden, in the world, but it wasn't really until I heard her talk that I really understood what is the implications of this, because the way she described it, And it was a theoretical talk on risk and how the state responds to risk and how we need to rethink risk in these contexts. And then she had an empirical section, and this amounted to a narrative of how, I mean, there were 2 lockdowns in India. They were both extremely severe, and they the consequences of them were that the government suddenly understood that there were workers and people in India who worked away from home and who were stuck. The government didn't do anything, so they had to walk back, or they had to just remain, or they were just stuck where they were and they couldn't survive. So this became a big problem. And then she continued to analyze that, and it turned into this kind of nightmarish, futuristic, dystopic story about a state who responds only through a lockdown. And there is no healthcare system in place. And there is no food. There is a repressive apparatus, police, military, going out and controlling, but people are staying in their places. So for how long can that state of society remain? I mean, either people will, they will simply die, they will starve to death. They are locked down, they are not allowed to move, they are forced to sit down in a square with their hands behind their heads in the case, because, I mean, all kinds of repressive measures. Anyway, so this is, and this gave a kind of frightening counterpoint to the European situation. And this, I think there is something with the state and authority that Milan, you spoke about it, and also Benjamin, about the political measure of a lockdown as a state measure in societies that see themselves as democratic, and what that really implies. And there, I mean, the contrast to this Indian situation would then be the Swedish one. We never had any lockdowns. There were never, I mean, nobody even, I mean, there was a small minority who suggested we should have them. There weren't any curfews, lockdowns whatsoever. I mean, things remained open. Finally, this Corona law, Celina talked about, managed to limit the number of people who could be in a store at the same time. That was basically, and then theaters, cultural centers, and so on, and the universities were closed, but schools remained open. And that is because there was a public health authority that realized, that took care of the public health, in the sense that it argued that no evidence that lockdowns in this situation would be good for the public health, because the children, they need to go, we all need to go out into the air. So there was a health argument against the lockdown as an alternative health measure against the pandemic. So so I just want to add this to the discussion, that there are 2 things that are kind of that remain. We should think about them more, and that is the repressive capacity of the state, and you measure that. But it's also this. You can have a repressive measure when you take care of the citizen, but when there is nothing there, when there is no healthcare apparatus that can sort of complement the lockdown and cure people, what happens then? And one of the things that remains to come out of the pandemic, I think, is a big, huge debate about the healthcare system, which we haven't really. I mean, we are waiting for that, but it hasn't really materialized. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So we could turn back quickly to the first question, to the one with the emotions, and perhaps have some very, very brief response. Do you want to start, Benny, or just as you have them?
But with regards to emotional fluency, I mean, there are, of course, aside from, just to sort of also, in a way, also to connect to Manuela's question and to Stefan's in some ways, I mean, that the thing that gets missed, and given the focus of our research, it's obvious that this will get missed. But aside from the general sort of distrust, isolation, and so forth, which we mentioned many times, there is, I mean, there were many sort of really organized solidarity, collaboration movements during the pandemic. I mean, people actually organized among themselves and helped out the people and so forth. There is also potentially a change in some workplaces with regards to this. There is also a possibility. So what I want to say basically is that there is a possibility that we disregard that this also sort of gave us, in some respects, more emotional fluency, and not only sort of destroyed our sort of potentials for such things. And also sort of connecting this to Manuel's and Stefan's point, I think that it's relevant, it is easy and relevant to focus on the sort of, what happened was that pandemic opened up space of possibilities, and this is something also that Peo talked about yesterday with regards to sort of state capacity and what we suddenly state could do during the pandemic, which before pandemic was thought unimaginable. And I think that the sort of repressive political forces and right-wing, or however, whatever we want, both the right-wing and the sort of more neoliberal technocratic, seized and saw these new possibilities. And I think that the sort of left has to also recognize that there is this opening up, and that we need to sort of, that this is the moment where we imagine new institutions, and this is the moment where we imagine actually new systems of governance. And I think that this is something that we still have time to do, and that we should seize upon this opportunity.
I'm going to try to maybe connect both questions in a way. So I think that for me there were, let's say, two kind of reactions which were mostly emotional in a way. And one was, this what we were studying, the right-wing movements, the people who were protesting, whose basic reaction was, okay, I want my right to do something. You are imposing this on me, and I am, a sovereign citizen or whatever, and I want it back. On the other side, people who were insisting on, rightfully of course, on public health risks, that we need to protect ourselves, we need to, stay at home, etc. For me, there is this kind of a really, of course it is justified, that it is a feeling of fear for this, our purely, biologically, our bodily health, which is, of course, the virus is the risks, is a risk. The problem that I had with, for example, I know there are some really left-wing people in Serbia who I personally know who were saying, doing these, Facebook analysis of answers to the pandemic, and their basic point was that Sweden, the example of Sweden is social Darwinism, and the example of the Chinese reaction is scientific. And for example, if you look at now in China, their answer to the Omicron strain, who is very viral, is ludicrous. Of course, you can't stop it from spreading, and it is pointless to do such harsh lockdowns to stop it. I think that, as Luka said, we need, a space to think about new ways of governing these kinds of situations, which won't have this kind of, harsh disciplinary focus only on our, biological existence. Because I think that that is good for a short amount of time, but we need to think of new ways where we can have, beyond lives which are beyond, which are, have this social substrate, but that at the same time won't expose us to these kinds of new, these health risks. And I think that it is a kind of a failure of imagination if we only think that, that the only answer is either do nothing or impose a lockdown. And I think that that's basically that, it is a kind of a space to try to imagine new ways of maybe thinking about these things, and to have in mind that we can't just reduce ourselves to either individuals with rights or individuals which are scared they're going to get sick. So it's kind of a Butlerian answer, maybe.
Two quick responses. One to what Stefan just said in your last intervention, and because it's not only that we haven't had this debate on the nature of our healthcare systems and how we need to improve and adapt them to an age of pandemics and an age of climate crisis. It's that we, at least in the Austrian case, I can attest to that. It's that the healthcare system is actively drained. It's worse now than it has been 2 years ago, which has to do directly with the COVID situation, because you have doctors and healthcare professionals who are just burned out. In Austria, it's now the case that all of the major hospitals have reduced the number of hospital beds because of lack of resources, and that is lack of human resources. And this is something that happens in a situation where we are actually now living through a new and ongoing wave of infections, which will fill hospital beds, and there's no debate about that. There's no idea of how a long-term strategy of transforming the role of the state. And then again, I'm coming back to the state, of how transforming the role of the state could look like and would have to look like in the face of coming challenges. So it's an extraordinary instance of ignorance, of active political ignorance that we are witnessing. While at the same time, the public discussion is mainly about how many weapons can we produce and ship to the Ukraine. Not that that's not important. But that's where Germany can, as we've heard yesterday, can just materialize 100 billion euros out of thin air, to support their military, but they cannot support their hospitals. And so, and this leads me to the question of the of affects and emotions and what kinds of emotions we encountered. In our research, I would say before the pandemic, there was a very strong case, and we've talked about this many times. There was a strong case of alienation, disaffection. I don't want to be part of this society. I don't want to be bothered with politics. I have my own problems. Leave me alone. And I think what happened in the past 2 years, and what will increasingly happen in the next years, is that you won't be left alone by history. You won't be left alone by politics. And this is, it's a nuisance. It's something that people are really upset about. How dare you, world, impose yourself on my personal freedom, my personal feelings. I don't want to be part of this, but you are, and increasingly so. And this will be, I think, in the coming months, people will experience in parts of Europe that usually do not experience, have not experienced that for generations. They will experience what it means to not be able to pay for your heating, to really have to think about your food security. This will affect sections of society who haven't had this as an issue for 3 generations. History bears on your personal life. This is, I think, what's in front of us, and this will unleash a bundle of emotions and affects that I'm afraid will also, that will have some political effects, and in some ways political effects that connect back to what we just talked about for the past 2 hours.
Yes, Benny, thanks a lot.
Sorry.
No, thanks a lot to you all on the panel for the really great discussion. Thanks for the audience for debating and staying with us. As far as I can see, lunch is served. Yeah, thank you and...